GoForThe2.com. Let's get right into the Week 11 predictions. Another great weekend of college football ahead of us. This is what it's all about. East Lansing, Michigan. Michigan State coming back home after a disappointing 39-38 loss at the hands of the Nebraska Cornhuskers. If you listen to my radio show, I did call for the upset in Lincoln last weekend. Nebraska had won, entering that matchup, 16 straight home night games. They made it 17 on a controversial pass interference call. Michigan State upset, played mediocre defense. They now come back home to face a very upstart Maryland team that's playing very well under interim head coach Mike Locksley. But this will be the biggest offense and defensive lines that the Terrapins have faced over the last 4 games. You look at who they played over the last 4 games. 4 weeks ago, they played Penn State. They lost that matchup 31-30. They then went on the road to Iowa, lost that matchup 31-16, came back home against Wisconsin, played very well, and lost that matchup 31-24. They now have to go on the road to face a mad, an angry Michigan State team. Michigan State's not out of the Big Ten championship. They still have to play Ohio State. Look for D'Antonio and the Spartans to be focused in this ball game. I don't expect Michigan State to overlook Maryland. I expect Michigan State to run the football at will against the Terrapins this weekend. Maryland allowing 167 rushing yards per game against their opponents. I think they get worn down by Michigan State offensively in this matchup. I look for the rushing attack of L.J. Scott and the running backs of Michigan State to wear down Maryland's defensive front. I then expect Connor Cook to work off a play action. I think he'll have a big day in the second half, and Michigan State dominates this game from start to finish. I think they put up a 52 spot. I call for a dominating home performance by Michigan State, 52-24 over the Terrapins. SEC. LSU coming back home after a disappointing 30-16 road loss to Alabama. They wanted to be able to run the football. Leonard Fournette held to only 31 yards. Brandon Harris could not make enough plays in the passing game to pull the Tigers to the upset victory. They now come back home to face an upstart Arkansas team that played its 3rd overtime game this season. They got the 53-52 victory over the Ole Miss Rebels. They had a face mask penalty when they went for 2 points in overtime that allowed them a second chance. They responded with Brandon Allen getting the rushing 2-point conversion to give the Razorbacks the victory, 53-52 in Oxford. Last year, Arkansas dominated this matchup 17-0. They held Leonard Fournette and that rushing offense in check. They now go on the road. This series overall, LSU over the last 5 years is 3-2 and has won those ball games by 11.5 points per game. I look at the speed of LSU offensively, and I think that's the difference heading into this matchup. I think Cam Cameron got out-coached last week. He didn't open up the offense enough and utilize his big play weapons, Traven Durrell and Malachi Dupree in the passing attack. Outside that big pass in the second quarter from Harris to Durrell for the touchdown that tied the game at 10, they did not open up the passing game, which would take pressure off the offensive line and allow Leonard Fournette running lanes later in that matchup. I expect a different game plan early on in this ball game. This is an Arkansas secondary that has given up 283 passing yards per game and cannot generate a pass rush. Arkansas only has 8 sacks on the year. So as long as Brandon Harris has time, I look for him to locate Dupree, locate Durrell in the short to intermediate passing game. I think that'll open up the rushing attack later in the game for Fournette, and I think LSU dominates this matchup. LSU still averaging 277 rushing yards per game. Harris completing 55% of his passes. But look for Cam Cameron to move the pocket to utilize Brandon Harris's mobility. And I think LSU gets a convincing victory this coming weekend. I think they put up a 40 spot. LSU gets the home victory 40-20 over Arkansas. Let's stay in the SEC right now. Alabama, coming off their dominating home performance, travels to Starkville to take on the 7-2 Mississippi State Bulldogs. Since 2010, Alabama's owned the series. They're 5-0 and have won those games by an average margin of victory of 17 points per game. Last year, they jumped out 19-0 at halftime before Mississippi State made adjustments and outscored Alabama 20-6 in the second half. The game plan early on for Mississippi State in that ball game was to allow Dak Prescott to stretch the Alabama secondary vertically. They came out passing and did not utilize Dak Prescott's mobility until the team was trailing 19-0 in that game. Well, you look at this year. Josh Dobbs gave Alabama some headaches with his mobility. He had Tennessee up early in the late in the fourth quarter before Jay Coker led the come-from-behind victory. Well, I expect a different game plan out of Dan Mullen this coming weekend. Starkville is a very difficult place to play. Dak Prescott has cut down on his passing mistakes that he did last year. He had 11 interceptions last year, down the last 5 games of the year. Well, this year, 18 touchdowns, 1 INT. He leads the team in rushing with 418 yards and 8 touchdowns on the ground. He showed poise. He's shown leadership. And more importantly, Mississippi State has cornerbacks that can play man-to-man coverage. Keep in mind that Alabama's wide receivers are still young and inexperienced. Calvin Ridley is a freshman. Although he leads that team and he's having a great year, he still is only a freshman wide receiver. Foster as well, inexperienced. So I like the secondary of Mississippi State matching up against the wide receivers of Alabama. I think they could create some pressure on Jay Coker. This is an active blue-collar defensive front. They're giving up around 167 rushing yards per game, but they play very well in pass coverage, play very well in man-to-man, which will allow Dan Mullen and the defensive staff to blitz Coker. I think they could cause some mistakes out of that Alabama offense, and I think they play Alabama tooth and nail. In the end, I think they are able to push Alabama to the limit. In the end, though, the Crimson Tide do get a 24-20 victory over Mississippi State, but do not be surprised if Dak Prescott and the Bulldogs pull off the upset on Saturday. In the Big 12, there's 2 marquee battles: Baylor, Oklahoma, Kansas State, and Texas Tech. Baylor has won the last 2 ball games against Oklahoma by 31 points per game. They dominated this matchup last year in Norman, 48-14. They're without Seth Russell, their big play quarterback. They have Jarrett Stidham, who stepped up on the road in Manhattan, Kansas last week, did lead the team to a first half lead of 31-10. Kansas State made it a game early in the second half. They lost 31-24. Baylor didn't make second half adjustments defensively, but at home in Waco, I look for the Baylor rushing attack to be front and center stage this coming weekend. Running back Shock Linwood. This is a Baylor offense that's averaging 308 rushing yards per game, averaging over 330 passing yards per game. Stidham, this is his biggest game all season long. But I look at the 2 games that Oklahoma struggled in from a defensive perspective. On the road in Knoxville, first half of that ball game, Tennessee and Jalen Hurd were able to wear down that defensive front. You look at in the loss to Texas, Texas had a methodical blue-collar attack that really wore down Oklahoma's front 7. They were able to run the football against the Sooners. I don't look for Baylor to have a methodical attack, but I do think it's the Baylor rushing attack that puts pressure on that Oklahoma defense. I look for Shock Linwood to really put his best foot forward, and I look for him to have a huge night at home in Waco. I think that's the difference. I look for Art Briles to utilize the short to intermediate passing game early on to get Stidham involved and gain confidence. But in the end, it is the rushing attack of Baylor that's the difference. You look at Oklahoma, they're playing very well in terms of offense. Baker Mayfield, Deron Neal, D.V. Westbrook, and Sterling Shepard, along with their running backs, Joe Mixon and Perrine, have been playing very, very well. But they haven't seen a rushing attack like Baylor up until this point. Baylor averaging over 300 yards. I think that's the difference this coming weekend. And the speed of Corey Coleman on the perimeter in the fourth quarter will make a difference. Look for him to have a big second half. Baylor gets a 10-point victory, 41-31 over the Sooners this coming weekend in Waco. I don't think Jarrett Stidham is the answer. I think he'll have some problems, but I don't think it's in this matchup. I do think Baylor gets knocked off later in the year, but not by Oklahoma. They get a 10-point victory this coming weekend. Let's look at another intriguing matchup. K-State travels to Lubbock to face the Red Raiders. Since 2010, Kansas State is 4-0 and has won those ball games by 21.7 points per game. You look at Texas Tech. This is their 11th straight game. They have not had a bye. This is a worn-out team, in my opinion. You look at this Texas Tech defense. They're giving up 273 rushing yards per game, giving up 283 passing yards per game, and their third down defense is one of the worst in college football. Texas Tech ranks 125th out of 127 teams in allowing their opponents to convert on third down. They're giving up 52% on third down defense to their opponents. If your defense can't get 3 and outs, your offense can't get field position, and more importantly, you wear down late in ball games. That's why Texas Tech has been allowing so many rushing yards. They've been giving up third down conversions, which sustains drives, which doesn't allow their defense to get off the field. You look at Kansas State. They rushed for 258 yards last week at home against Baylor. You look at that game against TCU. They held an 18-point lead against Trevon Boykin and the TCU Horned Frogs at home. I think Kansas State matches up very well on the offensive and defensive lines. I look for Joe Huebner to have a big day on the ground. And I look for Charlie Jones, the Wildcats running back, to have a big day as well. I think that'll open up the play-action passing attack later in that matchup. But I look for Kansas State to have a run-first mentality against Texas Tech's defense, and I think that's the difference. I think when you look at this matchup, Kansas State holds a significant advantage, and I do think that they get a decisive road victory. I think it's in the area of 14 points. I think it's high scoring. I think Kansas State does get the 48-34 road victory over Texas Tech. Another reason, Jakeem Grant battling an ankle injury that he suffered against Oklahoma State. Ankle injuries are very difficult to come back from. He was limited in terms of his playing. He returned a couple of kickoffs last week, but he's a slashing runner and wide receiver that likes to cut. If you can't do that with a bad ankle, it limits his productivity. Keep that in mind entering this matchup. Let's talk about an interesting, intriguing Big Ten battle. Michigan travels to Indiana to face the Indiana Hoosiers. Nate Sudfeld, I think, is poised for a big game going up against a solid Michigan defensive front. Since 2010, the Wolverines are 3-0 and have won all 3 games by 15.6 points per game. Michigan only allowing 80 rushing yards per game. They're only giving up 159 passing yards per game. But I think it's the speed on the perimeter by wide receivers Ricky Jones and Sidney Cobbs Jr. that put some pressure on that Michigan Wolverine secondary. I think Indiana will utilize a lot of different formations, and I think it's the rushing attack with Jordan Howard and Redding, their running backs, that will be able to run the football against Michigan. I look for Indiana to spread out the Wolverines' defensive front 7. I think Sudfeld starts fast. And the way you beat Indiana from an offensive perspective is you have to challenge them deep over the top. Indiana secondary is allowing 330 passing yards per game. Michigan's not built that way. Michigan likes to pound the football with Smith and then work Jake Rudock off of play action where he can find Jake Butt down the seam route or Darbo on post patterns. Well, if you're not running the football effectively, or more importantly, if you fall behind, sort of takes you out of that mentality. I think that's what Indiana can do. I think they can start fast, put the pressure on Michigan's offense to respond. And I think Michigan is in for a very tough road game this coming weekend in Bloomington. I think the Hoosiers push the Wolverines to the limit. You look at their defense in Indiana. They have 21 sacks on the year, led by their defensive end, Nick Mangieri. He leads that team in sacks, and Indiana's +5 in turnover margin. So keep that in mind. They're very opportunistic. They played Ohio State very tough, lost that game by 7. They lost by 8 to Iowa. They're now going to be facing a solid blue-collar team in Michigan, but I think Indiana matches up very well on the offensive side of the ball against the Wolverines in the secondary. I think Nate Sudfeld pushes them to the limit. In the end, Michigan gets a 3-point victory, 34-31 over the Hoosiers. One more intriguing matchup is Florida State. Florida State and NC State. Florida State has won 3 of the last 5 and has won those ball games by 27 points per game. Last year, NC State jumped out 24-17 in Raleigh before Jameis Winston led the second half comeback. Florida State won that matchup 56-41. But NC State playing very well defensively last week. They had 7 sacks on the road against Boston College. This is an NC State defense that's very underrated. Wolfpack only giving up 113 rushing yards per game. They have the 17th best third down defense in college football, allowing their opponents to convert 31% of the time. And this is a defensive front led by defensive end Mike Rose that can create sacks. They have 28 on the year. They had 7 in a dominating road performance last week in Chestnut Hill. They picked up that victory 24-6. Jacoby Brissett playing very well in the system, 14 touchdowns, only 2 interceptions. They'll be without Matt Days, their big play running back, but they have playmakers on the offensive side of the ball, like tight end Jalen Samuels, that leads the team with 47 receptions, and they like to utilize him on fly sweeps. He scored last week on the road in Boston College. He's a hybrid type of player that can catch the edge of opposing defenses and run that Florida State second defense sideline to sideline. Jalen Samuels has 8 touchdowns on the ground. This is a Wolfpack offense that's averaging 192 rushing yards per game, passing for about 206 yards per game. I think they're able to push Florida State to the limit on offensively and defensively. I think NC State's defense plays very well in man-to-man coverage. They played very well against Boston College last week. They're disciplined. They can create some turnovers. But more importantly, where is the Florida State emotional level after a disappointing road loss to number 1 Clemson? They led that game at half 10-6. They were tied entering the fourth quarter, 13 up, before they gave way to the Clemson Tigers. They played very well in the first half, but in the end, they still gave up over 500 yards of total offense to Deshaun Watson and the crew. NC State utilizes a lot of different variations of the Clemson offense, so keep that in mind. I think Clemson matches up, the Wolfpack matches up very well against the Seminoles in this game, and I think they're able to push the Florida State to the limit, and I do think they get the road upset. I'm calling for it in Tallahassee. Jacoby Brissett and the NC State Wolfpack get the upset 31-28 over the Seminoles, shock the Seminoles, and hand Florida State their 3rd loss on the year. This is what makes college football so special. These great games. Any game we didn't touch today, the big ones, I'll cover them on my radio show on the Yahoo Sports Radio Network this coming Saturday, 10 a.m. through 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Stay with me all season long. College football is the best. I just love talking about it.